Dear watchers, thank you for watching us in this new program. Today I have an interview with Jeremy Gimpel, and he is from Israel, but who he is and his background we will ask him. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you for having me.
It's an honor to have you here in the Netherlands. You are here for a tour. But to be honest, for me, when I heard your name, it was maybe a year ago. But can you explain to the people who are watching this program what your background is? Because you have a lot of things that you are doing.
Yeah, I don't even know where to begin. Maybe I'll begin with my family. My grandfather walked from Russia to Israel in 1915 when he was 16 years old. It was almost a little bit more than 100 years ago. And my father was born in Jerusalem. He went to the United States to study to become a doctor. And then I was born in that little window of time. And then we moved back to Israel when I was a little boy. So I maintained a pretty good English. And since then, I've been trying to connect the world to the real story of Israel. There's so much lies, so much bias in the media.
But what is your background? Religious or not religious? It's interesting because we see in Israel so much divisions in backgrounds.
Yeah, I'm a Jew.
Yeah,
and,
but...
I'm a Jew. I believe in the Torah. I believe in God. I try to live by the Torah. And I think that most Jews in Israel today believe in God, believe in the Torah. Now, some people may be more observant than other people, but the vast majority of Jews in Israel are believers in the end of the day. And so that wasn't always the case. At the beginnings of Israel, it was a very secular country. And now we see that there's a transformation happening within Israel. Very exciting time. Very secular kibbutzim that at one time would have nothing to do with the Torah, nothing to do with God, are now building synagogues for the first time on their campuses. And so I'm a Jew in the land.
You came back from, you came back in the land.
Yes.
From America, then you go to school. And what was your, had you a profession in mind, or did you have a call on your life? What?
Yeah, well, my father is a doctor and my mother is a doctor. And my parents wanted me to be a lawyer. In my family, you're either a doctor, a lawyer, or a failure. That's the way it is. And that's my joke for the evening.
Not a lawyer or a rabbi.
That's right. I told my parents, I said, well, I finished my law degree, and I was beginning to work in a law practice. And I told my parents, I said, listen, I don't want to be a lawyer. I want to be a rabbi. And my father said, a rabbi? What kind of job is that for a good Jewish boy? And ultimately, I had to make the choice, and I said, listen, I believe that I have a calling in my life to do something that's just beyond, making money and making business. And so I've been now pursuing spreading Torah, teaching Torah now for well more than 15 years. And so that's what I do.
But you're doing more than teaching. You're giving lectures, and you have a radio program, and you are doing something on
Yes, several years ago we founded an organization called the Land of Israel Network at thelandofisrael.com. And every day we're broadcasting teachings from Israel. And it's an interesting network because on one hand, sometimes we just have the news, just what's happening in Israel, but the true news. Without any bias, it's just pro-Israel, because the truth is pro-Israel. Israel's not at fault for jihad that happens in France or jihad that happens in Belgium. Israel is also suffering from jihad, and the world constantly is blaming Israel for the jihad against Israel. And so now the world is getting a taste of what Israel has been tasting since 1948. And so we're bringing the real news from Israel. But I think what makes our network very unique is that all of the teachers are believers. We all believe in God. And so you can't really separate the Torah from Israel. You can't separate God from what's happening in the land. And so our perspective very often is a fusion, a combination of spirituality and actuality. What's happening in Israel, and how does that relate spiritually to what's going on in the Torah, what's going on in our lives? What is God's plan for the world? And so our network is really to broadcast the Torah from Zion, like the prophets say. It's amazing to think that many of the Jews, they didn't want to return to the land of Israel. And they said, the land of Israel, there's no electricity, it's swamps, it's deserts. How will the Jews be a light to the nations if we're alone out in the Middle East? And as the Jews return to the land of Israel, God brings the internet into the world. And now, more than ever, the Jews are able to be a light to the nations and actually share what it is to be a Jew living by the Torah, building a country. My father was born in Jerusalem, and he remembers a time where there was only one road paved with asphalt. And all of the Jews in Israel called it the Black Road, because all of the roads of Israel were dirt roads. And now in just 70 years, Israel has become an economic superpower. Roads, highways, skyscrapers, biotechnology, high technology. Israel has exploded. And now to show that to the world is fixing the world. It's really our mission, to fix the world in the kingdom of God. And now the technology that Israel has developed is saving people's lives, allowing people to eat food and water their agriculture in Africa, things they haven't been able to do. And so Israel is slowly but surely actually entering into the role it was always meant to play, being a light to the world and fixing the world.
Okay, so your listeners or you're watching, the people watching the programs, are they Jews or also non-Jews?
It's really an interesting question. In our eyes, we almost always are speaking to Jews, encouraging them to move back to Israel, encouraging them to reconnect to their Jewish roots. But it seems as though at least half of our listeners, if not more, are specifically non-Jews that feel a calling to Israel, that love Israel, that come from some sort of Christian background, that they've discovered that the founders of Christianity, they were all Jews. They all lived in Israel. And now they want to mean, well, what does the Jews mean to them? What does Israel mean to them? And here's a place that even though I'm always talking to Jews, I always have the non-Jews in mind. So every word, if we ever say it in Hebrew, is always translated into English. And we're very sensitive to know that they're listening to us. And so it seems as though just on YouTube in the last few years, we have over 16 million views of the videos that we've put out. There's only 12 million Jews in the world. So clearly there's many, many non-Jews that are listening to us, that are watching us, that are learning.
You are now here for a tour to speak for Christians in the Netherlands. Can you remember your first meeting with a Christian? Because you grew up in a world from Jews. Can you remember that? Was it special or not? Because now you are here to preach. And are you surprised what happens in the Christian world?
Yeah, it's very interesting, especially because on Shabbat I was speaking to the Jews in Amsterdam, and on Sunday I spoke to Christians in Katwijk, and on Monday I spoke to Christians in Urk, and I had an opportunity to see also the Jewish community here in Holland, and also the Christian community in Holland. And it doesn't seem as though there's much overlap. It's kind of two worlds that are separate, and yet what connects both of those worlds is a deep, passionate love and respect for Israel. And I think it's shocking to most Jews to see that there are people that are non-Jews that love Israel, that hang Israeli flags in their homes, that celebrate Israel Independence Day alongside the Jews, even though the Jews don't even necessarily know it. Europe is not known for loving Jews. And it seems as though this is a relatively recent phenomenon, that at times Israel, the Jews, our greatest enemy, were Europeans. And now within these European countries, it seems that there are small pockets of people that are really seeking the truth, really seeking, what does the Torah say? What is the Bible and how does it really relate to them? Christians for the most part call the Hebrew Bible the Old Testament, making it sound as if it's old and irrelevant. But now we can see all of the prophecies of the Old Testament are quite alive. They're all happening right now in our lifetime. The revival of the Hebrew language, the revival of the land itself. And so Christians at one point maybe wanted to say that those were spiritual promises for a spiritual Israel, and now the church has replaced Israel and all of those blessings and promises are for them. And now they see that the Bible actually is true and what the words say or what the words meant, and that the people of Israel have returned to the land of Israel. And that was a wake-up call. What does that mean for them now? And now there's almost a revolution, and coming full circle all the way back to the beginning of Abraham. And now these Christians are sort of discovering what is their relationship to the Jewish people, what's their relationship to the Torah. And if they want to reconnect to the Torah, well, the Jews are really the oracles of the Torah. It's impossible really to understand the Torah without the Jews. And so now once again God has set up a scenario where the Jews can actually function as a light to the nations. And this is also a revolution, because for 2,000 years, Christians have been obsessed with trying to convince Jews to become Christian, constantly arguing with the Jews, forcing the Jews to convert, in a constant battle. And now for the first time, they're inviting rabbis not to try to convince the rabbi, but to learn from the rabbi, to actually come and learn from the Jews.
And that's what you're doing now in the Netherlands. And I was really impressed about your teaching, your lecture about Ezra. Maybe you can share something, because I think this is very prophetic in our time, what you were sharing as a rabbi to Christians.
Yeah, it was really interesting because many of the Christians came up to me afterwards and they said they had never studied the Bible like that before. And I said, well, that's great. You should have, many more teachings from many more rabbis.
Yeah, because you make the book Ezra's actuality. How can you explain to the people who are watching this program why it's still for this today?
Yeah, well, the big question that the rabbis of Israel ask, they say, why were some prophets entered into the Bible and some prophets not? We know that there were hundreds of thousands of prophets that lived throughout Jewish history. Why was Isaiah chosen? Why was Ezekiel chosen? Not only that, Obadiah, he only has one chapter, but surely Obadiah said more things in his life than just one chapter. Why was only one chapter chosen from all of the things that he said? And so the answer the sages of Israel give is that only a prophecy that was relevant for every generation until the coming of Mashiach entered into the Hebrew Bible. If there was a prophecy that was for one king, for one generation, for one person, that didn't enter. But a prophecy relevant for every generation, that came into the Bible. But what's a very special point is obviously it's relevant for our generation. We see now that all of these prophecies are coming to pass in our generation. But it was also relevant for the generation of the prophets themselves. And so we know that Ezra, who lived after the destruction of the first temple, was the first time that all of the prophecies before him could have been fulfilled. So you have Isaiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, Amos, all of these prophets that gave messianic prophecies of what the redemption would look like, what it would be the return to Jerusalem, what it would be like to build the temple. And here we have Ezra. If it's relevant for every generation, it was especially relevant for the first generation. Ezra was the only generation, 70 years had passed since the destruction of the temple. Now all of the messianic prophecies had the potential to be fulfilled. So when Ezra writes his book, really what he's writing is not just an autobiography of his life, but it's actually the story of how he understands the prophecies before him coming to pass. And then now with that key, when you read the book of Ezra, really it's a map. It's a map of how Ezra understood the redemption will come to pass. And then my whole lecture is just going through the book of Ezra. I don't bring any Jewish interpretations or commentaries. I just read the book knowing now that it's based on all of the prophecies beforehand. But when you read the book of Ezra, you'll notice that it's almost an exact parallel story to what Israel is going through today. That they're struggling to come back to Israel. The people that come back to Israel are not very religious people. They are intermarrying with the people that are there. And then there's a religious transformation that happens. And just like the secular kibbutzim, they're now celebrating Shabbat, building synagogues on their campuses. We also see that they were struggling with terrorism. They were struggling with very weak religious leadership in the beginning, that the priests couldn't even prove their genealogical records. We also see that the international powers of the world at that time weren't allowing them to build in Jerusalem. And we see that in Israel, for the last 8 years, when President Obama put a building freeze on the Jews in Jerusalem, so Jews in Israel said, what? Could this possibly be the redemption? We're not even free in our land, and kings of other countries are forcing us to not build in our own country. And here we see that Ezra suffered through the same exact challenges. But as Ezra was suffering, he wrote down signs for our generation, because also his book was written with a spirit of prophecy. And so as we read through the books of Ezra, what we see is a roadmap towards the redemption. And here we see that the roadmap is literally the roadmap that the Jews are walking down in our lives in 2017. And so one of the most overlooked books in the Bible that many people never even read is perhaps the greatest guide for how the redemption will unfold. Because we have a lot of fantasies of what it would look like. Maybe there'll be clouds, and maybe there'll be fireworks, and maybe there'll be miracles, and maybe that's true. But here we have one scenario that unfolded in Ezra's time of how he understood the prophecies of Isaiah, how he understood the prophecy of Ezekiel. And when we see how he wrote it down, and then we see the parallels of our generation, it's really unbelievable.
So we are on the roadmap what Ezra has written. So we are on the way. So we have a part, it was already there, and what will come now? If you read it, what do you think that will happen in the next years?
Well, there's probably two major shifts that will begin. And it seems as though the book of Ezra is very much focused around the Temple Mount. There's a struggle on the Temple Mount. At the end of chapter 3 and the beginning of chapter 4, they try to begin to take hold of the Temple Mount, and the enemies of the land begin to terrorize them. And then the international community gets involved. And we just saw recently now in Israel, there was a terror attack on the Temple Mount. And Israel tried to put up metal detectors to not allow Muslims to come and commit more terror on the Temple Mount. And there were riots in the streets in Jerusalem, and we see that once again the center of the story is focusing around the Temple Mount. And it seems as though at one point in history, the political leadership will be less relevant. Although right now, everything is about, is this politically correct? Is this not politically correct? Very soon the language will stop being about politics and will actually enter into a religious dialogue. And now I think even though Europe is a very secular country or a secular nation or a secular continent, they're starting to realize that the terror attacks in France and the terror attacks in Europe, they're not because of politics, but they're because of religion. And in chapter 5, we see that the prophets of Israel rise up and they point people back to God, and a spiritual transformation happens within the people of Israel. And the language, instead of becoming a language of politics, starts to become a language of faith. And the Jews there have to rise up and reclaim what's really theirs. But this actually affects not only the Jews, but affects the non-Jews around the world. And we see this also in the book of Ezra, that it says that the non-Jews, some of the non-Jews, separate themselves from the misbehaviors of the nations. And they join Israel and begin to celebrate Passover with us. And here we also see that there are many non-Jews now that stop celebrating the parades in Amsterdam, and they start celebrating Shabbat, and they start coming to Israel to celebrate Sukkot. And we also see another parallel in the book of Esther, which happened at the same time of the book of Ezra. And it says that many of the non-Jews of the nations started to behave more biblically. They started to, in Hebrew it says, mit yahadim. They started to live more like Jews. They didn't convert to Judaism, but they began to live a more biblical life.
The God-fearers.
God-fearers. And we see that that is exactly the process that's happening now. And it's happening in the United States, it's happening in Holland, it's happening in Japan, it's happening all over the world. And so we see now that this religious transformation that's happening in Israel is somehow a ripple effect that's now changing the whole world. And so the center stage of God's plan was always Israel. The first mission given to Abraham was to leave his home and move to Israel and build a nation. And so that mission continues until today, to build a righteous kingdom in the land. Some people think that to be godly is to separate from the world, to not get married, to not have children. It's a very European idea, to live in a monastery, to not talk. But Abraham's mission was not that. It wasn't to live on a mountaintop. It was to build a country. A country has taxes, a country has a military, a country has politics. It's to go into the physical world and bring God to the lowest levels of politics and create a righteous nation. What it would look like for a nation to take care of the poor, to take care of the environment, to take care of each other, to build strong families, and to live a holy life in the physical world. And so it seems as though Israel, that just 70 years ago didn't have any asphalt roads, has now built a physical empire with maybe the strongest military in the Middle East. And now the transformation that will happen, it will become a spiritual superpower that will ultimately change the world.
We can see what's happening in Israel is really amazing. It's unbelievable in a way. If you are watching the group of the non-believers who are behaving more and more biblical, what will be your advice, or what will be your question? What can we do to stand up for Israel? Because waving a flag, that's interesting, but it's nothing. I think we can do much more than that. What is the best what we can do for Israel to help or to stand up?
That's a great question. And I think particularly for Holland, there's a very good answer. You must come to Israel. It's so simple. It's not like going from California to Israel. It's a couple of hours on the plane, a couple of €100. And when you come to Israel, not only are you strengthening Israel's spiritually by coming, you just go down the street and you buy a falafel, You're helping that falafel owner. You buy a can of apple juice. You're helping that store owner. Just by living in Israel and walking in Israel, you're a blessing to the whole country. But also what happens to that person that comes, he's able to see the truth, where they call Israel an apartheid state, and they call Israel all of the lies of the media. Once you're in the land, you see it's all just lies, it's all biased. And so seeing the truth for yourself, and then something else also happens in Israel. A Jew can only receive prophecy inside the land. That's why when Jonah received his prophecy to go to Nineveh, he didn't want to go. So he gets on a boat to get out of the land. Outside of the land of Israel, it's almost like there's spiritual static. So much noise, so much chaos out here. Magazines and television and the culture. It's very difficult to tune into God. Inside the land of Israel, it's like our antenna. It allows us to receive direct messages. A clarity comes to us. Everyone that comes to Israel feels blessed because you can sense God's presence there stronger than you can outside of the land. And so for those people that come to the land, they themselves will be blessed, and they don't even realize what a blessing that they're being to the Jews that are there. And obviously, you can always pray for Israel. Obviously, there's always money that's needed. There's so many challenges that Israel faces. Imagine being only 6 million Jews surrounded by over 1 billion Muslims that say very clearly they want to throw us into the sea and finish off what Hitler started. So there's many challenges that Israel faces. But I think the best thing for people in Holland to do is to come to the land, see it for themselves, be blessed by being there, and then blessing the people of the land.
So that is the call at the end of this program about coming and going to Israel. And I think that the most of the people watching love to do it. Thank you, Jeremy, for this program. I want to have another program with you about Jerusalem. So if you want, for the next week, we will do another program with Jeremy about Jerusalem. Thank you.